How does it make you feel to see things like an idea for communicating about something so important that you came up with, for example, projected onto the White Cliffs of Dover, which is this sort of, iconic symbol of England? What does that do to you?
It's very emotional, right, to see it used all over the world. Some things we've organised ourselves, but most of the time it's others taking the idea and downloading our graphics and having creative ideas and running with it and doing amazing things. But we've had to change the colour scale twice now already, I think. 2023, 2024 was crazy in terms of temperature around the world. And so, we had to rescale everything and add an extra darker red as well to make it work. And I suspect we'll have to do that again and again.
Do you have a climate stripes tattoo?
I do not have a climate stripes tattoo. I have enough paraphernalia with stripes on around the house too.
I'm sure you do. I'm Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick.
I'm Iain Strachan.
And this is Totally Cooked,
the Climate and Weather Podcast. Today our guest is Professor Ed Hawkins of the University of Reading. Welcome to the show, Ed.
Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you.
Okay, so Ed, hopefully many of our listeners would be familiar with the climate stripes. But for anyone who isn't familiar, can you maybe explain what they are and where they came from?
So it's a very simple graphic, which we developed about 8 years ago now, which is a series of coloured stripes, 176 of them now, arranged from 1850 on the left to 2025 on the right. And they are coloured by the global temperature in that particular year. And there are blue stripes for cold years, red stripes for hot years, and various shades of light blue and light red in between. And what you see when you look at them is that at the beginning, the colours are very blue for cold temperatures back in the 1850s. And as time goes on, they get less dark blue, lighter blue, coming through to light reds, and then recently very dark reds indeed, highlighting the warming of our planet.
So it's basically showing how the temperature has changed over the last not quite 200 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it representing like global temperature change, or can we do it for other parts of the world as well?
So a version for the globe as a whole, and that's a very striking image. And we deliberately took away any of the other information. So there's no axes, there's no numbers, there's no labels. It is just a series of colour stripes to represent that warming planet in as simple and as visual and stark way as possible. Yeah. But we can also do the same for any country or any city around the world. And when you move to regions or cities, you see more variations. You see, a few blue or red years coming in places you might not expect it, because the weather and climate is variable, especially in the scale of a city, where you're more likely to get hot or cold years more often. And so what you see is you still see trends from going from mainly blues to mainly reds, but it's not quite as clear as the global average, where you're averaging across all of the weather variations that we see.
And it's so brilliant, as you've said, Ed, because of the removal of axes and things. It's so intuitive and instantly understandable. I'm wondering, when did the idea first arise to create something like this? Who cooked it up and when? Yeah,
it started, I was invited to speak, be part of an event at the Hay Festival, which is a very famous literature and book festival here in the UK. It's held in a tiny village on the border between England and Wales, but it's huge. People come from all over the world to visit Hay for the book festival. And so, most of the events there are authors talking about the latest book, but the organisers decided to arrange 3 events where they partnered an author or an artist with an environmental scientist. And I was one of the 3 environmental scientists invited to join. And I was partnered with an amazing author and poet called Nicola Davies. And so Nicola and I chatted, and she wrote some amazing, beautiful poems about climate science and about the research that we were doing. And she was going to read those poems at the event at Hay. And I was there to intersperse her amazing poems with a bit of science background as well. And so I was trying to think a little bit differently about how to present information to an audience who are basically going to be there for Nicola's poems rather than my science. And so I wanted as simple a way as possible to talk about our warming planet. So that was the key sort of moment where I was looking for something. And I recalled about a year earlier, a colleague of mine, Ellie Highwood at the University of Reading, she was a professor, she knitted a blanket for another colleague who's having a baby. And she was also inspired by knitters who regularly knit annual temperature stripes where they will measure the temperature in their garden that day and knit a stripe for the temperature of their garden that day. And so they will make an annual scarf representing the change in temperature throughout their year. So Ellie decided to knit a blanket with changes in temperature over longer time periods, over years. And so she made this coloured stripes blanket, very sort of bright garish colours representing the change in temperature and a whole series of very colourful stripes. Anyway, so that was part of the inspiration, and also being invited to Hay to talk to a very diverse audience. And I'm not quite sure how it all came together, but that's what happened.
You said that it's from 1850 onwards, Ed. Why is that the date that you chose?
So, 1850 is when most of our big global temperature data sets begin. And that's because that's when we have enough observations scattered around the world to be more confident about getting that big global picture. So the stripes as a whole, all those 176 years, there's probably about 1 billion measurements of a thermometer contained in that graphic, averaged over all of that time. There's more recently than back in the distant past, but from 1850, we think there's enough scattered around the world to enable us to draw that map of all the changes since then. We can start to think about further back in certain places where we've been taking temperature measurements for much longer, but for the global picture, we kind of tend to stick to 1850 onwards.
And I'm wondering, you came up with this idea for the festival in Hay, and I'm wondering, when you first started developing the first examples of it, what was the reaction like from people who you showed it to? Did you share it with your colleagues and get their take on it? And did you get a sense straight away that this could be something impactful?
Yeah, so I developed it for the festival, but I think I put it online on Twitter at the time, a couple of days before the festival, and it seemed really popular. So I thought, okay, this is working. So I decided to use it at the festival, and the version I used at the festival was actually a local one. So Sarah highlighted just now that we can do this locally. So I chose actually the stripes for the town of Hay itself to show at the festival. So I remember putting it on the screen and talking about what it represented, and you could see people's eyes open in the audience, recognizing that they could see the temperature change even in that tiny village, right? At the scale of a single location, it's very clear that the signal is there. We can see it. Every single place around the world has seen this warming, and so that makes it more real to people. The fact that you can see it locally where you live, rather than thinking about a big global average, which no one really experiences. We experience the climate and weather where we happen to live, and to understand it's changed in that one location, I think, is even more powerful.
Other than maybe having the year down the bottom or a few years scattered across the bottom of the figure, there is no data. It's just colours. And that is just so very effective, because a lot of people do get lost in the numbers or just can't interpret them like us scientists can. And therefore, if we use those numbers, it doesn't work in an effective communications way. So I think that's the beauty of it.
And it doesn't work for everyone, right? And I think that's also this works for, particularly I think, for an audience who maybe don't like normal scientific graphs, right?
I've noticed recently in many, many science talks, people will put a slide up with 6, 8, 10 different graphs or charts or plots on. And the first thing they'll say is, as you'll see, and then they tell you the data and you're like, I can't see anything, mate.
No.
So I feel like when I look at the climate stripes, it is sort of, as we've said, it's very simplified data, but it almost confirms your own intuition and maybe the anecdotal experience of your parents and grandparents that things have been changing over the course of the last, 50, 100 years. Things are different from how they used to be. And you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, that's what I'm aware of without perhaps ever being directly conscious of it. Yeah, it seems to speak to our lived experience and our shared cultural understanding of the way climate is changing. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. I remember, we used to have snow quite a lot when I was a kid in the UK. My little one, who's now 7, he's basically seen no snow. I think there's one occasion where he's built a snowman, and that would not have been the case for me as a kid. And so, these little things which you notice will have changed over time.
I'm trying to think, like for me, when I saw it, especially one for Australia, I went, well, shit, like there it is. This is what we've been talking about. Like for me, I knew it, but just even for me to see it in that format was pretty confronting.
In the UK, one really unhelpful example, there was a massive, massive hot summer in the 70s. I can't remember which year it was, but
1976, yeah.
There you go. So when I'm talking to my parents about recent heat waves, in the last 10 or 20 years, they'd be like, well, it's still not as hot as 1976. Hot summers are possible at any time. And it's like, yeah, but that was an absolutely bizarre outlier.
Yeah, it was. It's the 50th anniversary of 1976 this year. And so actually we're doing a bit of work over the next few months before the summer to actually try and think about questions like, if those same weather patterns, which were really freaky, if they happen again now, how much hotter would that summer have been? And the answer is going to be 3 or 4 degrees, hotter than then. And it was very hot then. It was just a really bizarre very long heat wave. It didn't break any daily records, but it was just very long heat for weeks. But it would be even worse today. And I think that's going to be a very helpful communication tool to try and flip the narrative about that summer, which is often used to bash us over the head. It was a really freaky summer, but it would be even worse today.
Ed, you mentioned that it went down well, the climate stripes, when they were debuted at Hay, went down well, and that they were gaining traction on the internet. When did momentum start to build for them becoming a long-running tool and being deployed in other environments? Can you tell us a bit about that part of the journey, please?
So I guess the next part of the story is there's probably a couple of examples. There was a weather presenter, weather forecaster in the US, in Florida, called Jeff Berardelli, and he saw them somewhere. And so he decided to get all of his weather forecaster presenter friends together and got everyone to use them on the same day later in 2018. So on June the 21st, 2018, the solstice, he got tens of weather presenters all across the US to wear ties and have mugs with the stripes on and talk about the stripes in their weather forecast, as trusted messengers about weather. They were there talking about climate to their audiences. And I think that was really powerful. And so now every year on the 21st of June, we have an event where we use the stripes globally to start conversations, and the weather presenters use them. But more broadly, there's giant bike rides across Netherlands with everyone wearing stripy clothes, and bridges and buildings get lit up with the stripes all over the world. But Jeff started that on the 21st of June 2018.
That is just so cool.
Yeah, and then there's another guy in Minnesota in the US who saw them somewhere and decided to wrap his Tesla in the stripes. And he messaged us to say, look, I saw this online, I've taken it, I hope you don't mind. And I took the car to a car show, a car show in Minnesota. It's not somewhere you're normally going to talk about climate change, I suspect. Anyway, he said he had more conversations about climate change in that one afternoon at the car show than the rest of the year put together. And it was because people came up to him and said, what on earth have you done to your car? Like, why does it look like that? So they started the conversation. And so he was able then to reply, to talk about what they represented. They would not have come over and asked him that if they knew it was about climate. And so that really struck a chord with us, that this was a very useful way of being able to start conversations you would never normally have about climate. And so we decided to work a bit harder on making them available for different countries, for different cities, making them freely downloadable for anyone to take and use in whatever creative way that they wanted.
Is there, were you approached to do the climate stripes on the back of you doing the climate spiral? Was there a link there between the two communication tools?
Not specifically. I was there just trying to think about communicating, in different ways, and came up with the stripes. Obviously I've had a long interest in trying to communicate graphically, and in 2016 we made the climate spiral, which again was a viral moment where did an animated graphic which represents the spiraling of global temperatures upwards and outwards, and that ended up being used in the opening ceremony of the Rio Olympics.
I remember you tweeting that. You're like, oh my God, here it is. Yeah, it was so cool.
Which was seen by 1 billion people or something, which is pretty extraordinary. Yeah, and so there's clearly power in developing ways of communicating to broad audiences.
Do you think, Ed, that the difference perhaps between the stripes and the spirals is the spirals you have to watch it for a little bit, whereas the stripes you can see it and get it in an instant?
So I think they're both very powerful in different ways. I agree. The stripes is an instant message as soon as you explain what it represents. The animated nature of the spiral means that people do have to watch it for 30 seconds, and there's a shock at the end, right? In the original version, it was during a big El Nino event, and so global temperatures were really hot, and so it was a big jump out right at the end, and it made everyone go, whoa, right at the end, what's going on? And then they watched it again, and then again and again, and people reported watching it, 10 times in a row, because there was this story being told, this narrative being told as they watched it, with a sudden surprise at the end. And so, it's a different way of communicating, but, different ways can be effective.
And you mentioned about the bus in Reading, about the Tesla. Sarah mentioned about the building in Reading that she saw. What are some of the other most interesting or memorable uses of the stripes that you're aware of?
There's been lots. Early on, there was a rock band called Enter Shikari who emailed me, so we saw it online, can we put it behind us during one of our gigs? And so we said yes, of course. And so there's sent us amazing photos of their gigs playing to tens of thousands of people with the stripes behind them, and they've got a song called Arguing with Thermometers, and they talk about climate during the set. They came to Reading. Reading's got a very big music festival, one of the biggest in the country, actually, in the summer. And they came to Reading and were playing on the main stage and had the stripes on the giant jumbo screens, talking about, what it represented and what it meant. So that was pretty cool. The other one early on was also, we got contacted by a fashion designer in London called Lucy Tamam, and she's a very sustainability-focused fashion designer. There aren't many of those. Anyway, she said, I'd like to put on a London Fashion Week show with a series of outfits with the stripes on. And then, lo and behold, a few months later, there were climate scientists going to London Fashion Week to watch a catwalk show, which is not somewhere we would normally end up. But no, it's fascinating to see that world and to see how it would start, that graphic would start conversations again to an audience which would never normally talk about climate.
Am I right in thinking that they have also been seen in Times Square in New York and even projected on the White Cliffs of Dover? Is this true?
A few years ago, we decided we were trying to organise some very large-scale projections. Yeah, so the first one we did was the White Cliffs of Dover, and an amazing image of the stripes there. They've been in Times Square in New York. There was a bridge in Brisbane which lit up with the stripes a couple of years ago as well.
Yeah.
What else have we done? We've done the Tate Modern building in London, and various other buildings around the world have been lit up. Hay Castle, London Tower Bridge. Yeah, they've been used all over. Even the Pope has been given a scarf, or the previous Pope was given a scarf with the stripes on at one point, and now they're actually been exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So again, something I'd never thought I would see happen, but something that I've created in the Museum of Modern Art.
So climate scientists are notoriously humble. I have to fight against Sarah's imposter syndrome on a weekly basis. So I know this might not be your kind of area of comfort, but how does it make you feel to see things like an idea for communicating about something so important that you came up with, for example, projected onto the White Cliffs of Dover, which is this sort of iconic symbol of England? What does that do to you?
It's very emotional, right, to see it used all over the world. Some things we've organised ourselves, but most of the time it's others taking the idea and downloading our graphics and having creative ideas and running with it and doing amazing things. That's been amazing to see, actually, that people in every country around the world have seen it somewhere and gone, I want to use that. And so we've enabled them to do that. But most of the time we have no involvement, and it's great that it's kind of been a sort of natural movement which people have adopted and made their own, and that's just been fantastic to watch.
I was going to ask you, Ed, what's next for the climate stripes? And in particular, are the colours you originally chose still working, or have you had to cook up some meaner shades of red recently?
Yeah, I mean, the planet is totally cooked, right? And so, but we've had to change the colour scale twice now already, I think. 2023, 2024 was crazy in terms of temperature around the world. And so, we had to rescale everything and add an extra darker red as well to make it work. And I suspect we'll have to do that again and again as time goes on to represent, that a wider range of temperatures in the same set of colours. And that's a message in itself, a bit like the rescaling of the Australian temperature map. We had to add an extra purple or pink or whatever to the map in Australia. It's a message in itself that you suddenly you go beyond what you're used to experiencing.
Did you expect when you created them that you'd need to be changing the colours so fast, within 6 or 7 years?
I mean, I never managed to have to make it again. But no, definitely not. Things have changed pretty fast over the past 8 years. Since we first developed them. Having to change it is sobering. So we do have versions with the future as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, we have to use a different colour scale, but we have two choices for the future. We have a 3-degree future world and a 1.5-2 degree world on the other side as well, to try and highlight that our actions do make a difference for how we experience what comes next. We have a choice to make as a global society about where we end up, and we could choose to take faster action and end up in lighter shades of red, or we choose to delay and we end up in darker shades of red and more trouble. But ultimately, as global citizens, that's our choice.
There was a figure that came out of the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they have that figure. They've used a different colour scale, so it's like yellow through to purple, but it's effectively the climate stripes, and it has that choose your own adventure future. I think it's even just more than 2 scenarios, but then they've also put icons of people being born at different times, so maybe people born in the 1950s all the way up to when my last child was born, and you could see the difference their lives could be dependent on what future we pick for ourselves. And that in itself is also really powerful. So I've even seen it, I guess, extracted to other communication ways as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so that started in the Working Group 1 report in Chapter 1 last time.
That's right.
And then it made its way to the synthesis report. It was amazing to see. But the addition of those icons of people and the future, I think, really did add a huge amount of a very powerful message about our kids' futures and grandkids' futures.
I got to admit, it's really tugged at my heartstrings. I can't remember exactly what the last year was, but it was around the time I had my last child. I'm like, oh my God, all right, her future's pretty screwed if we go down that wrong path. It's, even for people like us, I still think it opens our eyes at times as well.
Ed, you've become well known now for studying and communicating about the Earth and the climate. But I read that you actually started out studying things beyond this planet with a PhD in astrophysics. Yeah. Can you tell us about what that was like and also what brought you back down to Earth?
Yeah, so when I was a teenager, I was always fascinated by astronomy and wanted to do astrophysics. So I studied physics at university, and then I was lucky enough to get a PhD place at the University of Nottingham in the UK to do a PhD in astrophysics, which I loved. Studying distant galaxies. I got to visit Australia actually for use one of the telescopes at Coonabarabran one year, which is pretty cool. Yeah. But no, so I loved it. But I got to the end of my PhD and went, do I want to spend the rest of my life doing this? And I decided no at that point. And I actually went out and got a job in the real world for a year and didn't enjoy that either. And that was 2003. And 2003 in the UK and Northwest Europe was a very, very hot summer. It's our 2019 or something. It's one of those events which really did change opinions about heat. It killed tens of thousands of people across Europe that summer, that event. And suddenly, that climate became a much bigger topic, much more discussed, I think. And that made me realise that, actually, I could use physics in a different way. I actually applied for the job at the Met Office in the UK, and they didn't want me. I didn't have any climate meteorology background. So
was that with Peter Stott and his group?
I don't know I can't remember who I applied to work with.
We've actually got Peter on next week to talk about that heat wave and attribution. So we'll ask him if he rejected you.
I will.
And so I thought, right, well, I'm going to go away and learn what I need to learn. And so I actually quit my job and went to do a master's course after my PhD in meteorology and climate at the University of Reading, with the plan to go and work for the Met Office after that. But I kind of never quite left Reading. There was a research position which was advertised just as I finished my master's. With one of the lecturers, I went to have a chat with him and said, would you even consider someone like me, my background? And he said, yeah, apply, see what happens. And, he took a bit of a risk and gave me the job. And it's worked out great. And I've really enjoyed applying physics in a different way and actually trying to choose a subject which feels more relevant to everyday decisions that we're having to make. I still love astrophysics. It's a fascinating subject. And we need to keep studying it. But I felt like I needed to do something a bit more relevant.
I don't think your story is actually that uncommon. I've heard of quite a few climate scientists that come, maybe not necessarily astrophysics, but from a much more hardcore physics background. Yeah. But then you all came to your senses and worked with us.
Yeah. And I think partly it's because climate has grown as a discipline so fast over the past 20 years. We just haven't had enough base training PhD students to fill all of the research positions that we've needed to. And so we've had to bring in people from outside. Yeah. And so
that's okay.
Yeah, which is great. And you can ask stupid questions, right, when you're new, right? And that is really helpful. You can come in, use something, ask stupid questions and learn lots by doing it.
I think we actually just need to give everyone permission to ask stupid questions, because I don't come from a physics background. I come from a physical background. And I must admit, I still find it very difficult to ask stupid questions. We've talked about this. It's a problem here in Australia where most people don't understand all of a science talk despite being scientists themselves. So I think we just all need to validate that it's fine to put your hand up and say, can you go through that again? I don't quite understand. It doesn't matter what your background is leading into this field. So you mentioned, Ed, that you went to the University of Reading and just kind of stayed there ever since, and you're part of the National Centre for Atmospheric Science. So can you tell us what this centre does and your role in it?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have a number of big research centres. We have the British Antarctic Survey, which is, in charge of our Antarctic bases. We have the National Oceanography Centre, which is in charge of our ocean research. And then there are others. And then we have the Atmospheric Science Centre, the National Centre for Atmospheric Science, which I work for. And so we are essentially the group which are funded centrally to be a core group of climate scientists and weather scientists and air quality scientists who are there to do core research on weather, climate, air quality for the UK. So it's quite a diverse group, but that's our role.
So how does that work then? So you mentioned like the hints in the name, atmospheric science. So you've talked a bit about that, but you also mentioned climate. Does that mean that you also interact with other components of the climate, like the Oceanography Centre or the Antarctic Centre, or do you kind of keep to your separate little silos?
So traditionally we've kept to our silos, right? But I think, more recently that's become unsustainable. And so, there are now giant programs between these different centres. And so, we have joint projects with the Antarctic Survey, the Oceanography Centre, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is another one of these groups. So to bring all of those pieces of the puzzle together, because climate is huge. We need the ocean, we need the ice sheets, we need the land surface, we need the atmosphere. And so we need to join together all the dots and bring the whole groups together. And so, yes, we are increasingly doing that.
And government commitment to and funding for modelling and observations is a bit of a hot topic around the world at the moment. There's been some worrying cuts and progressions in the US under Trump. And we're also having a few funding challenges here in Australia with supercomputing capacity and climate modelling at our National Science Agency. And I'm wondering, what is the landscape like in the UK and Europe at the moment? Is funding relatively secure? Are governments taking it seriously, or are there challenges there as well?
I think it's a mixed picture. I think, there are some positives. I think our central funding agency have got a reasonably good funding settlement recently, but how they split that up, I think, is going to be the big challenge. There's actually huge challenges for our astronomers at the moment. They're facing huge cuts. For example, we've just had the funding cut for our atmospheric research aircraft, which is really disappointing that we will no longer have an atmospheric research aircraft. And some of the centres are also facing quite significant trims to their budget. So no, it is challenging. I don't think we're in the worst case out of many countries, but we're certainly facing challenges as well.
What's the logic behind cutting that funding?
I think it's a complicated situation with the airplane. It's quite an old airplane, so it's cost quite a lot to keep running. They've just spent £40 million on an upgrade, and then they're going to scrap it. Because it's going to cost too much to run in the future. That was the airplane that went up. So there was a big volcanic eruption in Iceland a few years ago, which grounded all of the airspace over Europe for days and days. There was only one plane flying, and that was the British aircraft going up to measure the ash where it was going to try and track when the airspace was going to be safe to open the airspace over the UK. And now we don't have that capability anymore.
So I guess I'm just super frustrated because, obviously things are getting bad in the US, as we all know. Things aren't looking so great here for Australia's climate model. And I'm just so baffled as to why people don't see the benefit in long-term monitoring and investing in research that may not have tangible benefits now, but will do in the future. It's just that short-sightedness I struggle to understand.
Yeah, I mean, we're facing huge cuts to our land station monitoring system as well.
Right.
I'm sure BOM struggle with this as well, right? With maintaining enough stations around the country, and we are facing huge drop-offs in for example, our rainfall monitoring network. We used to have about 7,000 rain gauges around the country. We're now down to about 2,500, which is still lots, right, relative to many countries, right? But it's a huge drop-off because actually, many of those stations are actually run by the rainfall network, are run by volunteers, people who have rain gauges in their large back gardens. And they're often getting old and retiring and sadly dying, and they're not replaced. And so all of those observations are now lost forever because, we're just not taking the measurements anymore.
Oh, that's really sad.
Whole generation of back garden rainfall monitoring and climate stripes knitting is being lost.
Step up, everyone. We need you.
There's an interesting story about those rain gauges, though. That we've actually in the UK a long history of measuring the weather. As you can imagine, we talk about the weather all the time in the UK. And we've had thousands of people measuring rainfall for centuries. And a lot of that data was lost, right? It was on paper only, sitting in our archives and not being digitised and available to scientists to analyse. So, we've actually also spent a lot of effort over recent years in trying to rescue that data from the archives and make it available to science once again to fill in some of those gaps in the past and to put all the changes into a much longer term context.
The mark of a good guest on Totally Cooked, Ed, is preempting the questions you're going to be asked. And the next section we're drawing to is called Rescuing Climate Data Through Citizen Science.
So cut out that bit and we'll start again then. Fine.
No. I mean, it's perfect. It's a natural segue. So I've read that you're involved in a citizen science project called Weather Rescue.
Yes.
It's not about rescuing people from the weather, though. Can you tell us about it? What does it involve?
We might need a program like that too.
We might, but that is not this
but
program.
Anyway, no, it's not this program.
Yeah. So I guess the story here started at the summit of Ben Nevis. Ben Nevis is the highest mountain in the UK, in Scotland, 1,345 metres above sea level. You know, it's not that high, right? But it's a high mountain and is normally in a cloud when you get to the summit.
Well, because it's in Scotland, so
yeah. And between 1883 and 1904, there were 3 meteorologists who lived at the summit all year round, winter and summer. Essentially, they were snowed in and cut off for the winter. They were delivered rations in the autumn to allow them to survive over the wintertime. But the 3 of them lived there, and they took manual weather measurements every single hour of every single day and every single night for 20 years without stop, apart from when it was blowing an absolute gale, occasional breaks. But yeah, it was their dedication. You know, they were there because they were at the highest point in the country. They wanted to take as detailed measurements as possible, and so they took all these hourly measurements of rainfall, of sunshine, of wind, of temperature, obviously, and pressure. And none of that data was available to climate scientists a few years ago. It was all in printed tables in giant volumes and books, and it had never been made available for us to use. And so we decided that was not a good place for the data to be. So we decided that we would run a project where we would have all the images of those pages, of these tables. We'd put all the images online and ask for volunteers to transcribe the numbers from those images into a web page where we could collect the data and analyse it. We got 4 people to type every number to make sure that that if people occasionally made a mistake, we would capture that. But yeah, we were able to, rescue about 1.5 million of these observations from those paper records taken by those observers at the summit of Ben Nevis 100 and odd years ago. Yeah.
Was it the same 2 people for 20 years?
I think there was one of them which was there the whole time. There were changes in the observers. There were occasional guest observers. They did have short holidays sometimes in the summertime.
That's insane.
Yeah, it was extraordinary effort in the Victorian era. And I like to think of them as actually, this was the great era of exploration when, we were visiting the polar regions by ship, right? And I consider these weathermen as the explorers of the atmosphere for the UK, right?
Yeah,
they were living in rustic conditions at the summit of a mountain. There's a few photographs of them on the occasional day where it was actually sunny. They took some beautiful photographs of the view over the valleys beyond. So it's an amazing effort. And so, we managed to rescue the data. We actually, a team from my organisation carried up a modern weather station to the summit of Ben Nevis, installed a modern set of equipment up there to see if they could measure what the temperature was doing now and can be able to compare to what was measured 120 years ago. And the equipment failed within a week because it's so cold, it's so humid, it's so windy. Our modern equipment cannot deal with the weather conditions. It would have to be done by hand if it was going to be done at all.
Ed, you might have mentioned this. I was so blown away by the scale of that undertaking that it could have passed me by, but were they paid by a forerunner of the Met Office? Who was funding that initiative?
Yeah, so at that time there was the Scottish Meteorological Society, and they were the organisers. It was actually crowd-funded partly. They actually went around, the local town of Fort William shaking buckets to collect money to pay the weathermen living at the summit. I think Queen Victoria threw in 50 quid at one point to help out. But eventually they ran out of money, and so that's why it closed. Yeah, the Met Office was becoming more sort of dominant in terms of funding. They didn't want to fund it anymore, and so that's why it shut in 1904.
That's extraordinary. It really is an amazing story. I'd like to maybe do a whole episode about this at some point.
So when I went to Hay to speak, and so Nicola, one of the poems she wrote was about the weathermen of Ben Nevis, and you can find that online. It's a beautiful poem.
Ed, your weather rescue project, was that purely for that Ben Nevis data, or does it try and rescue other historical data?
So that's where it began, and it wasn't the first one to do this. So there was a team led by Philip Brohan at the Met Office who'd done an earlier project to look at some ship data, to try and recover ship data. And other people have done it since. The largest one we've run in Reading was called Rainfall Rescue, which we ran during the COVID lockdowns. There were 5 million measurements of monthly rainfall amounts taken across the UK and Ireland from the 1700s onwards up to about 1960 on 66,000 sheets of paper, which the Met Office had scanned. And we put all those images online, and we had 16,000 volunteers typing in those 5 million numbers 4 times each, but 100 million keystrokes were needed to transcribe those. And, these pages have been sitting in the Met Office archives for over 150 years, some of them, and the 16,000 volunteers transcribed a lot in 16 days.
I'd rather put pins in my eyes than do that.
Well done to them.
There were, for a lot of people during the lockdowns, actually, it was amazing. It was a massive escape for them. And they were able to have a distraction. We were lucky with the timing. That there was a big distraction from the horribleness of what was going on in the world. But that wasn't the end of the story, actually, because just transcribing the numbers was actually only the beginning. We actually had 8 volunteers who stayed with us for the next 2 years because we had to find out exactly where every rain gauge had been located in space. Right. So we knew when the observation was taken and what the observation was, but we didn't know precisely its latitude or longitude. And so these 8 volunteers went through these thousands of pages to try and identify exactly where the rain gauge was, whose garden it was in, which reservoir was it next to, which train station was it near. And that took about 2 years from dedicated sleuthing from these 8 volunteers who went through ancestry information, they went through census information, they found old maps online. There were occasionally rain gauges marked on old maps, which was very helpful. But most of the time there wasn't, and they would work out from the census which house someone had lived in and therefore where the rain gauge was. And so then we were able to hand over the data to the Met Office, and the Met Office were then able to, extend their rainfall records backwards in time. So we now have very detailed rainfall records in the UK going back to 1836, which is nearly 200 years, which is extraordinary. And we found a new driest year on record. The previous driest year was in the 1880s, but it turned out that 1855 was even drier.
Yeah,
and so, we actually found new records by going backwards rather than forwards in time. And the 1852 had a sequence of really wet months. So, you can find these really interesting extremes from the past, which are really valuable for us to know about today by digging through these old paper sheets.
So something that can be an issue, I've just given a lecture on this, so this is why it's fresh in my mind, is the fact that we don't have complete observational data in space and time. So hence why it was so important you go and track where these stations are located.
Yeah.
But how do you account for that? Because it may have been that you had a clustering of some stations in some parts of the UK, but not in others, or they weren't recorded every day for whatever reason, or even human error in recording the numbers. Yeah. How do you account for that to know that you have these new records as opposed to them just being a bit of a cluster somewhere or a misrepresentation?
Yeah. I guess because we hope that, we have to trust the numbers that are written on the page, but of course there may well be errors, just like there are errors made today, right? Occasionally by misreading an instrument. We hope we have enough observations that we can pick out the outliers, which aren't quite right. There's all kinds of statistical tests you can do to pick out outliers. You have to fill in gaps by statistical methods in between stations, just like, it's done in Australia with some of the gridded data sets that you have. It's exactly the same in the, and for some regions we can go back before 1836 because there were clusters, certain parts of the country, often the wetter parts of the country, they liked taking rainfall observations. And so there are certain parts where you can see where there was clusters because they loved measuring the weather, or there was a local scientific society which had an interest in the weather, and so there was a whole sequence of observers who would take it in their local region. But again, a lot of them were volunteers, and it's that nice story from volunteer observers, mostly men, occasionally women, taking observations, often landed gentry. And then coming through time, we now have the volunteers transcribing the numbers and then the volunteer sleuthers. So it's a wonderful story going from volunteers all the way through.
That's amazing. And those people should be lauded.
But we wouldn't use volunteers now. Just in the last 5 years since COVID, right? Things have changed in the world of AI. We can now feed these sheets through, and I've got a PhD student who's currently working on using some of the modern large language models, which are now getting to the stage where they can read these sheets without hallucinating and actually reading the numbers very, very accurately without making so many mistakes. We won't probably have the need for running these big volunteer projects, except for the really hard to read stuff. So I think we can now do it in a different way.
That could have huge implications for other parts of the world as well. Like I'm thinking in Africa where there's a lot of records literally wasting away every day. Yeah. So that would just be absolutely phenomenal to have that sort of technology.
There's an amazing team working in Belgium who are rescuing large amounts of data from the Congo. The Congo is one of the biggest gaps we have in Africa. It's a huge country with very little data. And so there's another PhD student sailed up the river in Congo to different archives where they don't have any electricity, no power at these places. He had to take all his batteries with him for his camera to go and take the images of these documents, which were literally rotting away in these cabins in the middle of nowhere. But no, he took all the photos, brought the images back, and he's used one of these he developed an automated approach to read some of the pages, and now where he's about to publish the data from 30 odd stations around the Congo for 3 or 4 decades, I think. So, we're starting to fill these holes in our maps, but it takes a huge amount of effort to catalogue, to scan, to image, and it's very difficult. And there's also sensitivities around the images and the data being made openly available for many global south countries. They won't often allow outsiders to come in and take images, for example, for understandable reasons. So, there are lots of sensitivities which have to be tackled as well.
Well, that's an amazing story about the Congo. I'm looking forward to seeing that data and being able to use it.
It's a funny coincidence that we had Joyce Kumite from Imperial College on last week or the week before, and she was just talking about that very thing, that, records from where she's from in Kenya are a bit sketchy, but Congo even more so.
Yeah.
Did you say that was a PhD student who had done that?
Yeah, so a guy called Derek Maheki, who's based in Belgium. So Belgium was the country that governed the Congo for a long time, and so that was the link why the Belgian group were doing that. Yeah.
Maybe someone we could chat to at some point, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear his story.
Do you know how people can get involved in that now? Like if somebody decided they wanted to start recording the rainfall in their garden in the UK or in Australia, are there organised ways to do that? What's the landscape there?
So, in the UK, they can probably contact the Met Office or the Environment Agency, which run a lot of the gauges in England, different organisations in Scotland and Wales. I don't know what the situation is in Australia, whether BOM have a similar volunteer activity.
Who knows?
There's also in Europe, there's an organisation called WOW, which is People's Garden Weather Stations, supporting that is unfortunately having funding cuts at the moment. But, there are all kinds of these activities where people can plug in their weather stations essentially into and upload their data in real time for it to be used. The quality of those garden weather stations is often not the highest quality we would want to use for climate monitoring, but for seeing what's going on around the country at any time, it's very, very, very valuable. I think a lot of it they think it can be automated, and I think that's
right.
For example, monitoring, right? And in many cases, it is automated. Power cuts happen, right? There's no substitute for someone going out to take the rain bottle out of the rain gauge and measure the amount of water that's fallen, right, rather than relying on an automatic gauge which could have a power cut or have something fall in it or whatever. So often there is no substitute for doing it by hand, but I'm not sure that's always recognised. And it's the same with our airplane, right? This airplane is flying right through the whatever we need to measure, and the argument is we can do it all with drones, and that technology is going to maybe get there at some point, but I don't think we're there yet. And it's certainly not going to take to other countries and fly it around like happened with the plane.
So Ed, like Sarah, you've made the interesting life choice to put yourself out there as a high-profile climate scientist who tries to communicate about this important issue to the media, to the general public. And from what Sarah has told us, that can be it can range from a thankless or futile endeavor to outright upsetting or scary. And I'm wondering, I've written here, why did you decide to do that? But then perhaps the question is, did you actually decide, or did it just happen and now you have to deal with the consequences?
It's probably a bit of both, I think. And I think, when I came into the science, it was quite clear that there were not many people keen to do it, to step up, and it became more and more important. And I think I guess I became quite active in the sort of the science just before an event called ClimateGate, where a load of emails got stolen from the University of East Anglia in the UK and misrepresented wildly online with a big fuss, and it caused the breakdown of one of the COP summits, essentially, arguably. Anyway, so climate science was in the spotlight hugely, especially in the UK. And I remember, there was a huge gathering of, climate scientists. We all got together and said, what the hell do we do about this? And it became very clear that, we needed to do better at communicating. We need to be more open and transparent than we probably were at the time. And so, I think there were quite a few of us after that who maybe started dipping our toes in social media and therefore, occasionally invited on to talk to the media as well because of that. And it snowballed from there and more people got involved. But no, occasionally it is a thankless task. Occasionally we all get abuse, but occasionally we get wonderful moments where, it all works out really well. And so that's why we do it.
I've had people send me flirty emails all the way down to maybe her child might die when they walk to school during a heatwave. Neither are appropriate.
No.
Let's just be clear. But there has also been some very thank you for what you do emails in there as well.
Do you think we're getting better at climate science communication? You mentioned that after ClimateGate, you got together and thought about how you could improve. Do you think that in the last, well, that would be almost 20 years now, but in the last 15 years or so, has that changed?
I think we've made huge strides, and I think until a couple of years ago, I would say that we had been very successful. We had the Paris Agreement, things were moving in the right direction. There are strong winds, which are now headwinds, which are pushing us back in the wrong direction, I think, now. And a lot of that is coming from the usual sources, funded by the fossil fuel companies who are promoting disinformation, misinformation amongst all kinds of groups around the world. And it's very difficult to fight that with our very limited resources. So yeah, they're huge headwinds, I think, through no fault of our own. I think we've improved our communication. We could do better, obviously, always. We know the science is there, it's solid. We understand that it's unequivocal that humans are warming the planet, and that we know what we need to do. The only way to stop it is to get to net zero. It's very simple messages, and we've got a lot of the technology to do it, and it'll be a lot cheaper when we get there. It's just the transition which is going to be tricky.
I'm just going to say that recently, I think the main issue is America and Trump specifically. That's really been a massive game changer, because we're even having countries like China. It's looking like their emissions have peaked and they're responsible for roughly 1/3 of global emissions. That's a good news story, right? They're heading down now. But then you have the US, firstly, having this war that we don't really need and putting up all that extra carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And then on top of that, unwinding all of the progress they've made and the globe has made in the last decade. That will take at least another decade, if not longer, to build up. So I think for me, at least, that's where I see the biggest current roadblock. That's what's pulling the rest of the world back.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting,
and now,
isn't it?
I'm not going to get into America for a while.
So we've talked a bit about how climate science has changed in the last 15 or 20 years. What about other governments? In the years that you've been involved, for example, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Ed, how do you think the response from our elected officials and our public servants has been to climate science information?
Fundamentally, I think they all understand what the science is telling them. Through the IPCC process, the reason it's so hard at the end is to get every single country has to sign off on the summary of the science, and that is a very difficult 2-week process. It was, but it's there because it means that every country has agreed with what the science says. Right, and that is a very powerful aspect of the process, that they have to officially recognise and formally recognise that the world is unequivocally warming because of our actions, and so they do recognise that. In the UK, we have been, I guess, pretty good in that we're the first country to have a climate change act. We have a climate change committee who independently advise the government and have done since 2008. I think we've halved our emissions. We're doing pretty well in the global picture. There's a lot more to do. We've done the easy bit by cutting out coal. We don't have any coal power stations anymore. They've all gone now.
Yeah.
We've done the easy bit, and we're building more and more renewable energy all the time, so to start replacing the gas. But there's a long way to go, and as we've just discussed, right, there is resistance because it's hard to make change, and people don't like to change. Even when they drive their EVs and these are really fun to drive. They're easier to drive.
I love it.
It cost me 15 times less to charge than to fill up fuel because I can charge at home. These transitions, when they're made, people go, well, why didn't we do this before, right? But just making that change can often be really hard, and we need to promote the right actions from people. We need to offer sticks and carrots. We need, recognise that, yes, if you make the right decision, you will financially benefit. I think that's really important. We need to, tell the car makers that you won't be allowed to sell any combustion engines from 2030. And that's, that makes them invest in a different way. And that's another way that we can make action happen really quickly, by providing the direction of travel for companies that they have to follow. Otherwise, they won't be able to sell their products anymore.
I saw your alarm there, Sarah, when Ed revealed that there's no coal-fired power stations in the UK anymore.
Shit.
And it's like maybe we need to start shaming the Australian public into,
Happy to.
So it's like, the Ashes, Australia always wins the Ashes, but they're lagging behind the UK in the coal burning stakes. So it's, come on.
Well, we're burning less than we used to, but we're just digging it up for other countries. And on top of that, a few years ago, I was like, gas will be the way out of our reliance on coal. And, oh no, let's go to nuclear. Like, they're literally throwing every other option And when we're looking at our emissions, we haven't gone up that much, if anything, over the last few years, but they're relying on the fact that we haven't chopped down any trees or nearly as many trees since 2005. So we haven't really done that much to reduce our emissions. They're not actually decreasing in real terms, and that's problematic. That's all around the political framing.
And you have a lot of sunshine, right? This is
really
free energy, right, coming from the sun, and you have a lot of it, right? Unlike here.
Yeah, so like if the UK can do it, Australia, so can we.
Yeah, I think Australia's been really good with rooftop solar, but I want to see more imagination and ambition from federal and state governments on utility scale solar, like huge farms in the desert, send it in some cables, job's done. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but you know what I mean. But Ed, I was going to ask, what are some obvious mistakes to avoid when talking about climate change and extreme weather?
I've got one, but I'll let you go first.
Ooh.
Thinking noises.
I think when we're talking about changes to our weather, I think we need to focus more on talking about how climate change is affecting our extreme weather, right? Because, we often talk about, it's a global warming of 1 or 2 degrees, right? And that means nothing to anyone, right? On a UK day like today, right? 1 or 2 degrees will feel really nice, right? But 1 or 2 degrees warmer, you wouldn't really notice 1 or 2 degrees. And so I think we face a communication challenge in persuading people that 2 degrees is a lot when it doesn't feel like it on a day-to-day basis. But when we get an extreme event like you get a big cyclone hitting Brisbane, or we get a huge rainstorm coming across the UK, or we get a big heat wave, right? The heat wave is more than 2 degrees hotter, right? Actually, in the UK, our heat waves have gone up by 4 degrees or something, 4 or 5 degrees. And you start to notice 4 or 5 degrees during those very extreme days because our infrastructure starts failing. Our schools get too hot for our kids to learn. Our offices get too hot. The outdoor digital infrastructure struggles. The roads and railways aren't designed for that heat. And so it's when we get the extreme weather that we're going to struggle the most. And we'll get 10% more rain falling from a storm, which means more people are flooded. And I think those are the types of messages we need to continue to communicate, rather than focusing on an average change of 1 or 2 degrees, because I just don't think that's going to get us anywhere. But when we can talk about an extreme event getting 10% wetter than it would otherwise have been, or 4 degrees hotter than it would otherwise have been, therefore more people died, or the wildfire risk was higher, it's that when we start to really make people realise the consequences of what the warming means for them.
So my tip was, don't freak them out too much.
These two positions may not be reconcilable.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? Because I completely agree with everything that Ed said. And again, this is what I teach. I'm in a heavy teaching block at the moment. And, it's the extremes that kill. Like, who wants to be in a heat wave in Canberra at 49 degrees Celsius? Because that's a heat wave 5 degrees hotter than now. Like, that will kill you. At the same time, though, like, I see their faces just go, oh. And it's like, however, it's a choose your own adventure. We're still not at a point yet where that's completely locked in forever. Yeah, I struggle with this myself sometimes giving talks, but there's that, you've got to give that hope that it's not completely belly up and we should just give up, because that's when it becomes overwhelming.
And I think it's also been very noticeable since I started here that, when I first started to give public talks, talk to the media, I would, talk about what's going to happen in the future, about what the projections say about, changes to extremes. And now when I give a public talk, I don't actually talk about the projections of the future. I just talk about the changes we've already seen, because they're so stark and obvious that people have lived and sometimes died through. And so there's no need to talk about the future, because it's already happening. It's already a reality for all of us that we're facing these extremes. And yes, they're just going to get worse the hotter it gets. And I think that's a much simpler message to talk about how we're already affected.
Maybe we should start calling it climate changed.
Yeah.
I like it.
It's very simple but very powerful.
Ed, you mentioned about your unusual path from doing a PhD and then doing a master's and then transitioning from astrophysics into climate change. Do you have any advice for young people, school students, university students who are interested in working in this space?
Follow your passions, right? Do something that you're passionate about doing. Choose a subject which you enjoy studying. There will always be a route to use that subject in sustainability careers in the future. So, actually at the University of Reading, we now have a sustainability scholars scheme where you can be doing any subject around the university, but be given a scholarship to spend some of your time working on thinking about sustainability issues and how it affects your own subject, and learning about how sustainability is embedded across every single discipline, every single job that you might imagine going into. And yeah, it's that way of telling people that whatever your interest and passion are, you can first of all make it part of your working life, but also your personal life as well, right? So yeah, follow your passions.
I would second that.
And my last question is, are you optimistic about the future of our climate and weather?
Some days yes, some days no. I think we've seen so much progress. We have so many opportunities ahead of us to transition to a more sustainable net zero world. But then things happen which make you doubt whether we'll actually ever get there. And you see the changes happening. We are experiencing it. We see how society will suffer in the future, and you worry for the future as well. But, as Sarah says, right, we get to choose what happens next, right, through global society choices. And that seems challenging at times, right? But, you see the progress that China's made. China's building more renewable energy than the rest of the world put together, so that there is a way of doing this. We have the technology, but it's fighting those battles to persuade people, politicians, companies that they're going to need to make these changes. But no, you can see a future where things are brighter. Right. And we have to enable people to see that and to go, yes, the transition is going to be really hard, but it will be worth it.
I think we've just also got to make the transition attainable for most people. Like, we are very privileged to have all these cars and batteries I mentioned. Not everyone can access that, and we need to change that.
Well said to you both. My final thought is, I pitched up at the University of Reading in 2004 to do my undergraduate, and the only notable person I can remember who was an alumni, I'm sure there's more than this, but was a jazz musician called Jamie Cullum, who was somewhat popular in the 2000s. And I feel like the University of Reading might now be best known for the climate stripes. So well done for putting them on the map, Ed. It's a huge achievement. Your stripes are the face of the University of Reading.
I just want to ask, Ed, is your car wrapped or your house covered in the climate stripes somehow?
We have discussed wrapping the car, it has to be said. We haven't done it yet, but it has been discussed.
And that's it for today. And thank you so much to Ed for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great.
And thanks to you, dear listener, for tuning in. Join us for the next episode of Totally Cooked.
And we'll tackle the climate crisis together.
We will.